True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with sand.
The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
During an 8-month period in 1977 and 1978, the city of Columbus, Georgia, was terrorized by a mysterious serial killer who raped and ritualistically strangled 7 elderly women in one of the community's finer neighborhoods. Despite intensive efforts on the part of police, the Stocking Strangler, as he came to be known, managed to elude capture. After the last murder in April 1978, the case went cold. In the spring of 1984, a series of fortuitous events connected to an unrelated murder and a stolen pistol led to the capture of Carlton Gary, who had recently escaped from a South Carolina prison. Following a dramatic trial in 1986, Gary was convicted of 3 of the 7 Columbus murders and sentenced to death, a penalty that would not be carried out until 2018. This convoluted tale of crime and punishment is punctuated by dramatic twists and turns, including issues of race, alleged conspiracy and misconduct on the part of the police and the judiciary, and errors in DNA analysis. The book that we're featuring this evening is The Columbus Stocking Strangler, with my special guest, author William Rawlings. Welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, William Rawlings.
It's my pleasure to be here, Dan. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on this book that is to be released September 6th. So by the time people hear this interview, it will have been released just recently. Congratulations on this book. This is an incredible, wild tale, as we talked about just before in the introduction. Let's get right to Columbus, Georgia. And you talk about that it really occurs, these crimes really occur in a village of Winton, about 2.5 miles east of Columbus, Georgia. So this occurs in as you talk about a crime wave in 1977. Tell us a little bit about Columbus, Georgia, and this village of Winton, who it comprised, members of society, who lived there, and a little bit about Camp Benning and its relationship to Columbus and this story.
Today, Columbus, Georgia is the state's second largest city. But if you back up a good bit, and by that I mean to the 19th century, when it was founded in the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, Columbus was a river town. It was the uppermost navigable reach of the Chattahoochee River. It's because of the river, it's always been a mill town, and it's always been a somewhat wealthy city over the years. During the Civil War years of the 1860s, it was a major town for production of Confederate armaments and so forth and so on. In the 20th century, there are still mills there, but the economy is diversified, and today it's a fairly wealthy and very cosmopolitan city. It's a nice place, and I like Columbus a lot. I have nothing but positive things to say about the town. Winton, the district of Winton, at one time was a separate village a couple of miles inland from the river, but today has been engulfed by the city and is basically a very upscale neighborhood. There are some modest homes, but some of the finest homes in this city itself are located in this area, and a number of people with social prominence and a good little bit of wealth are there as well. It's an interesting part of town, but it's very definitely part of urban Columbus.
Let's talk about, as you describe, as you title, Crime Wave, September 11th, 1977. In this predominantly white neighborhood. Tell us who is attacked and how.
Well, this is in a chapter of the book titled Crime Wave, and I should say that there were a series of violent crimes, perhaps no more so, perhaps less so than today. But at the time, there were several robberies, murders, rapes, and so forth and so on. On September 11th, 1977, elderly white female named Gertrude Miller was who ran a kindergarten, was attacked in her bedroom by a man. She woke up and found this person standing over her. There was a brief period of time when the light was turned on and she recognized him as being a black male. He beat her savagely and then raped her. She was apparently left for dead, but she did not die. And a neighbor discovered her the next morning. And that was one more crime that had occurred in a series. And yet it was the start of this series of events attributed to the Columbus Strangler.
There was a description made by Gertrude Miller, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. She described him as being a fairly young black male, being handsome, having a short afro, having, I believe, no facial hair at the time, and this and that. But she actually had a fractured skull, and there was always some question as to whether or not her identification was completely correct, although she insisted quite well that she saw the guy, she'd recognize him again, et cetera, et cetera.
What did police do with this composite? Was it released to the press or the public?
Well, the police, not that moment, it was a little bit later on in the series of events that occurred. The police realized that this event was apparently the first of a series of events, which became known as the Strangler's Reign of Terror. They later went back the next month and they interviewed her. They got a composite drawing of her, which they passed around. It was not particularly helpful, but that was a matter of some sensitivities that showed a black male in the black community. The African-American community was concerned that they were trying to pin this on a person of color. And that was a sore point there in Columbus for the longest time.
Right. You write that 6 days later, September 16th, Miss Mary Willis Jackson, known as Fern, didn't show up at work. She was the director of education for the Columbus Health Department. She's 59 years old, and she was a widow as well. What do her daughter and police find? What's her state?
Well, she was a pillar of the community and very prominent and very well respected. She simply didn't come to work one day. Someone discovered that her house had been broken into, her car had been stolen, and they found her body. She was naked, the waist down, and her face had been covered up like Ms. Miller. Forgive me, I forgot to say that Ms. Miller was her attacker apparently attempted to strangle her, apparently with a stocking, although that was not exactly clear at that point.
Right.
But Fern was strangled with her stocking, and other than her car, her valuables were not taken. It appeared to be a very savage murder, the same sort where she was savagely beaten and then raped and strangled and left dead in this case. So this became the first murder that was attributed to the Strangler. You have to understand that you have to have several people before a trend is happening, and this was the second one, and people begin to say, oh, it looks a little bit like Ms. Gertrude Miller's event.
In terms of forensic, hair samples were gathered. What did they find, if anything?
They found in this case and in several others that there were foreign hairs that appeared to be pubic hairs that were described as being, quote, negroid. That is the term that was used, not mine. And it was sort of assumed that the attacker in this case was a black male, the same description that had been given with Ms. Gertrude Miller earlier. This, in order to avoid inflaming racial sensitivities, the alleged race of the attacker was not made a big issue. They simply were looking for somebody.
Right. Now you write that soon after, we're talking September 24th, Gein Diamonstein, 71-year-old retired co-owner of a little department store. She was unmarried and she'd lived in her home for 23 years. There was a break-and-enter attempt the night before. So tell us what happens the night before and then what happens with Gein Diamonstein.
During this period of time, and let me say, we're talking here between September 1977 and the early part of, say, the winter of 1978, there were a number of burglaries in this district. Ms. Diamonstein's neighbor had an attempted break-in at her house. The person was unable to get in. It turned out the next night, the apparent same person returned and broke into Ms. Diamonstein's house. And again, she was raped and murdered with a crime scene that was very similar to the one of Fern Jackson, in the sense that she'd been strangled with a stocking, her body was covered up. And this pattern of the arrangement of the murder scene would occur in subsequent murders attributed to the strangler.
One of the most horrifying elements of this crime was regarding the door.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
She had a door to her carport and was locked, of course, but apparently it was put on in such a way that the hinges were to the outside, so someone simply took the hinge pins out and removed the door. And the lady that discovered her body came up and found her door had been removed and realized to her horror what might be found, and that's when the police were called and her body was subsequently identified.
Right. Now, this is raising panic in the community. You get headlines from the Ledger Inquirer, sex killer strikes second time, second elderly woman in 9 days found molested and strangled in their homes. And then there enters someone that is an important figure, a coroner Kilgore. Tell us what he has to say and what it sparks eventually.
The coroner in Georgia is an elected position. You have to understand that. And one needs only a modicum of medical background. That's usually done by what are called medical examiners in the state. Right. And so you've got a politician who is elected office, and sometimes they make statements that are inflammatory. He made a number of statements that said that the killer was brutal, that he revealed details of the crime that the police said should not have been revealed. He alleged that the killer was probably black, although the police were trying to keep that information confidential. And he was a bit of a thorn in the side during the entire investigation, according to my opinion from what I have read.
Right. Now, the police proceed. They look at footprints, latent fingerprints. How successful are they at obtaining any of those? And you write that soon a suspect with a question mark emerges.
Well, after the first two murders and the attack on Ms. Gertrude Miller, the police were under a tremendous amount of pressure to solve this. These were particularly violent and vile crimes, and the most innocent of victims, three elderly ladies. And so the police were under a lot of pressure, and there was a 25-year-old African-American male named Jerome Libas. Libas was, to use the term at the time, he was of limited intellectual abilities, and that was from multiple accounts, and was sort of a pitiful fellow, I guess. So he had a girlfriend who was about 30 years older than he. She was in her 50s, and apparently they got in a dispute. He alleged that she had, quote, been with another man, end quote, and he actually strangled and raped her. She was an elderly, a middle-aged black female. The MO of the two, that is strangulation and rape and a violent attack against a woman, was vaguely similar. The police knew that the police thought that the crimes were committed by a black male. So they got Jerome to confess to the first two murders.
Right.
And it was a terrible situation because the man was pitiful. The police chief began to say, well, we've got ourselves a suspect. And the mayor said, we've got a suspect. And the community started to breathe a sigh of relief. And when they called up the district attorney at the time and presented the evidence to him, no, he said, listen, you don't have enough evidence to convince this person. And despite the fact that he, quote unquote, confessed, this is not legitimate. Number one, he could not read the confession that he signed. And number two, he signed it one evening and he recanted the next morning.
Incredible.
So it appeared that the police were trying to frame this man or pin these murders on him. Then more happened, and it became evident that he was not the killer, although he remained in jail for the murder of his girlfriend.
Yeah, it's interesting and very compelling that evidence that he may not be the killer, may being an exaggeration or understatement. You write about October 21st, 3 days later after it seems like they have a reasonable suspect, a good suspect, the apartment of Florence Scheibel. She's a widow living independently, just released from hospital as well with a broken hip. And her son, Paul, would visit every day, checked on her every day. Tell us what happens. What do police and his son find?
Miss Scheibe was perhaps the most pitiful of the cases. She was 89 years old, 10 days shy of 90 years of age.
Yes.
She had had a host of medical problems and was said to be essentially deaf and, for the most part, blind. She saw things with a blur. And perhaps her only joy in life was getting out in her front yard with her walker and trying to pick things up. She was just really a pitiful thing. And there was testimony from neighbors and witnesses that she would commonly leave her front door unlocked when she was out in the yard. Her apartment building, it was a bit of a duplex, upstairs and downstairs apartments, and she was right on the street. So it appeared, it was postulated that when she was out of the yard, someone slipped in her front door. She would not have noticed it. Accordingly, when she came back in, she was attacked and again brutally raped and murdered. She was strangled with a stocking. Her neck was broken. She was beat up like the others. And it was horrible. Her son and his wife came. Her son came to visit her. He found that her door was unlocked. He called his wife. He was afraid to even go in. It was his wife who discovered her mother-in-law dead.
Now, you say that any kind of calm that had been established with this suspect being arrested was gone.
It was. And you have to understand now, this is the third of the first three murders. This is the third murder plus a fourth attack, assuming Ms. Miller was attacked by the same person. And so you had a community that was breathing a sigh of relief at the supposed arrest of a suspect. And lo and behold, here you have another vile murder that fits the same pattern. And this, in essence, sort of frees suspicion from Jerome Livas. He remained in jail, of course, for the other murder. And to fast forward a little bit, one of the newspaper reporters in town, a fellow named Carl Cannon, was suspicious, and he finally got an interview with Livas. And Livas at the time admitted to being present at the Kennedy assassination and the McKinley assassination.
Sure.
And was present when the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, I believe, in the 1930s. And it was very, very clear that almost no matter what you said to him, he would agree to it. He simply was not mentally capable of this. And it became quite evident that the so-called confession that he had signed and then recanted was one that it had not been recorded by the police. They had written it down. And so there was no evidence that he actually said what he did. And it's pretty clear that he was being framed by the police.
Certainly didn't do anything for police credibility at that point.
Absolutely not.
And then Martha Thurmond, the 69-year-old widow, retired school teacher. And this is interesting, too. The response from residents is that they put burglar bars and alarms and did precautions, screens on their windows. And she had done this. He had installed extra deadbolts. What happens to Martha Thurmond?
She suffers the same fate as the other murders. That is to say, she was attacked in the middle of the night and beat and strangled and raped in the same general pattern as the others. The interesting thing about this particular episode was that her son had been there and had visited with her over the weekend and actually had left a few hours before she was murdered. He had installed locks on her door, and apparently one of the locks was installed backwards. That is to say, the screws for the deadbolt lock were exposed to the outside, so all it took was a few simple turns of a tool to take her locks off and get inside. Wow. And, of course, that led to her death there.
And she was another person that was strangled with a nylon, correct?
Yes. Of the 7 murder cases, 5 were strangled with nylon, with stockings, I presume nylon. 1 was strangled with a scarf, and the other one was strangled with a blind cord, a small cord as you'd use to open or close curtains.
You say press and citizens began referring to the killer as the Stocking Strangler, hence the title of your book.
Well, at this point, you had, 4 deaths, all of which fit a pattern. Actually, if you include the attack on Ms. Miller, you had 5 that were murders or attempted murders where the victim was strangled with a stocking. And it became, and also, as if you look at the crime scene reports, the bodies were positioned in such a way that the face was covered up and the rest of the body may have been exposed, this kind of thing. And so it became evident that apparently one person was committing these crimes, and they were all in a very close neighborhood. For example, Ms. Ms. Thurman and Ms. Schreiber lived quite close together, as did the others.
Now, there's a psychological profile of the killer released. Won't fixate on too much. It says black male, 16 to 21, high school graduate, possibly bedwetter, fire starter, or animal torturer. Cunning, no anxiety, remorse, or guilt, lives near the crime scene area, sexually inadequate, pathological liar. Pretty general.
Yeah, that's it was, and I think as a I won't say a move of desperation, but as an attempt to get some insight, some of the people checked with the FBI profilers, and I think it's been pretty well established that profiles are not necessarily accurate. This profile, if you read it carefully, was fairly generic. It could have been any number of people. And while there were some things that may have fit the eventually identified killer, there were a lot of things that didn't. I don't think it was helpful at all, but it gave some people something to think about.
An interesting development, Gertrude Miller is, again, the police. It's common in some at that time for them to want to gain further information potentially from hypnotizing her. So a composite, and this hypnosis is done, and a composite is done at that time, I believe. Maybe you can tell us about that. But also a task force is set up with a person named Ronnie Jones, I believe, as the head of the task force. Tell us what the makeup of this task force is. Tell us about that development.
Well, by this time, you had, 4 murders and 1 attack at least. You had, and I should say that there were a number of burglaries in the neighborhood, too. So
right.
People attempted entry into homes, and It may have been that there would have been more murders, more violent crimes, but everyone was scared, very much so. And the pressure on the authorities, and that is not only law enforcement, but also the city government, to do something. Everyone says we can't have this happening. I mean, you've got lots and lots of police on the street. Everyone is trying to catch this mysterious strangler. By this time, he became known as the Strangler. Everyone was trying to catch the Strangler. And so we're going to solve the problem in the old-fashioned American way of setting up a task force. And it was mentioned before the start of the year and really kind of got off the ground good fashion after the new year of January 1978. But the idea was that they would exhaust every possible manner of solving this problem, and yet it didn't make any difference. Nothing really happened. The police days off were canceled. Everyone was working 12-hour shifts. There were assistants brought in from the FBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. There were helicopters flying around at night, shining lights on the neighborhood. There were thousands of records of people that were pulled over by the police and simply questioned. They still exist, by the way, huge card files of them. And nothing happened, despite the efforts.
December 28th, Tommy Stevens is a maid at the home of Miss Kathleen Woodruff. She's worked for her for 33 years. So she finds something out, but not right away. She discovers something about Kathleen. Tell us what happens, what she discovers.
Miss Woodruff, Kathleen Woodruff, was a very prominent citizen. She was a member of the very wealthy and very prominent Woodruff family. She was the widow of a former University of Georgia football coach. I believe Woodruff Field and one other building at University of Georgia in Athens is named for him. She was highly respected, and she lived again in Winton, in a nice part of town, and she had a maid who had been with her for years. Her maid comes in one morning and discovers that she's still in bed, sleeping, but it apparently was not outside of the fact that sometimes she simply slept late in the morning. Her maid had noticed it when she'd left the night before. She had been sitting at a desk, perhaps writing a check or something like that. And after a while, when she didn't wake up, her maid went in and looked at her and realized that she had blood coming out of her mouth and she was in fact dead. She called her son, who identified the body. It's interesting and ironic in the fact that she was not strangled with her stocking, but strangled instead with a University of Georgia scarf, which was ironic in the sense that there was a big relationship between her late husband and the University of Georgia. She was perhaps the most socially prominent individuals of the strangler had murdered up to this point. And of course, this just stirred the pot further.
You say there was a reward offered as the panic grew, $20,000 now, and then some. And there was patrols in the Winton area, so the police presence, some visible, some not so visible. You say break-ins were diminished but not eliminated, and 2 residential break-ins of interest occurred in this period of time as well, didn't they?
Yes. Which ones were you referring to? There was so many of them.
There was a Mrs. Swift.
Yes. There was Swift, and who? And the other was?
The Ilges.
Ilges, okay. The Swifts and the Ilges had very large, fine homes and were persons of substance and wealth. The Swift house was a large white-collar mansion that was broken into. The Ilges house, which was described as being, quote, the castle, end quote, vaguely resembled a English country house, was actually broken into twice. Once was on New Year's Eve, or December 31st, January 1st of 1977, 78 during the night, and was broken in a second time about a month later, I believe. In the case of the Swift house, the burglary happened when no one was home. But in the case of the Ilges home, the Ms. Ilges, who was elderly and fit the demographic of the Strangler's victims, was there, but also her husband, who was in his 80s and was medically infirm, was in another bedroom. And part of the pattern, as it would turn out later, looking at things retrospectively, was that the Strangler would not kill a woman, kill one of his victims, unless she was alone in the house. So the fact that this woman's husband, Ms. Ilges' husband, was in another bedroom on the second or third floor of her home, apparently deterred the Strangler from harming her.
Now, while police are investigating, there is a Miss Schwab, another widow. She had installed alarms like many other women, and that alarm was connected to her next door neighbor.
This was another situation where the woman survived the attack of the Strangler. She was quite wealthy. The Schwab, I think is how I pronounce her name. Schwab ran a large business that she had inherited from her husband. She lived alone. She was concerned that she fit the demographics of the Strangler's victims, so she had talked to her next door neighbor, Dr. Fred Burdett, and they had each installed alarms such that she could press a button at her house and he could press a button at his house, and then they would check on each other. Well, it so happened that there had been at least one false alarm, and in the middle of the night, Dr. Burdett is woken up by the buzzer ringing. So rather than call the police immediately, because there'd been one false alarm before, he calls Miss Schwab next door, and she doesn't answer. And of course, he immediately calls the police. They both enter her house, and it turns out that she's alive and sitting on the edge of the bed with a stocking wrapped around her neck. She had been the Strangler's next victim, but had managed to fight him off. And the phone call when Dr. Burdett had called her back to check on her apparently terrified the Strangler, and he left and got away that night. But as it were, he went on to kill another woman, another victim in the neighborhood. He simply hid in the bushes until the coast was clear. And then apparently early that morning, right before daylight, killed another victim just down the street.
Mildred Borum.
Ms. Borum, right.
Yes. Now, can't dwell too much on what happens next, even though this is an incredible development. Mm-hmm. But the Klan steps up and volunteers to assist the police. Of course, the police aren't asking for the Klan's help, but an even more incredible development happens after from a group called Forces of Evil. Tell us about both of these bizarre and dangerous developments.
You have to understand that the Ku Klux Klan, even in the 1970s, was considered a bunch of evil racists. Nobody seriously supports the Klan in the South, despite their allegations to the contrary. I mean, the Klan is just total outliers. And they, since everybody had sort of, quote unquote, knew, end quote, the Strangler was said to be black, that they were going to sort of start doing patrols in the neighborhood, which just horrified everyone, most importantly, the police. Not much came of it, but it was just another twist. Perhaps the most interesting thing was that the police chief in January, after the first of the year, 1978, began getting letters from someone who signed himself as the chairman of the Forces of Evil. This person sent, I believe, 6 or 7 or 8 letters to the police chief. During the course of this one-sided correspondence, the chairman revealed that this was a white supremacist organization and that they thought that since the Strangler was black and killing white women, that they, as white supremacists, were going to kidnap and kill black women. And as it turned out, 2 black women were kidnapped and killed. Well, it so happened that this so-called white supremacist organization was, in fact, a black male named William Henry Hance, who was a soldier stationed at Fort Benning. Fort Benning is a large military institution that abuts the southern border of the city of Columbus. He himself was a serial killer who apparently killed a total of 4 women. There were 2 in Columbus. He was identified through his own stupidity by using U.S. Army paper stationery, and his voice was recorded, and eventually someone at Fort Benning recognized it. He was apprehended. He eventually came to trial and was executed for the murder of 2 women there in Columbus. It was a totally bizarre situation that another serial killer was using the episodes attributed to the Strangler to cover up his own murderous intentions.
Incredible. You write that Mildred Borum was killed February 11th. You write about April 20th, Janet T. Kofer, a 61-year-old widowed kindergarten teacher. She doesn't show up for class. What are some of the same characteristics found there?
She was the one victim who lived a little bit further away. She was the Strangler's so-called last victim. And she lived not too far away, but was not. The first six murder victims lived within an area where one could walk from one house to the other in less than 10 minutes.
Right.
This lady lived perhaps 15 minutes away, but nearby in the same general area, I should say. She simply didn't come to work one day. When she didn't, someone from her school goes by, noticed the screen has been cut. The police are called, an entry is made to the house, and again, her body was like the others, the same tragic crime scene. She was strangled and her body positioned and covered up as the others had been.
There is a Chief McClung, and he, as you write, he paints a dim picture of the investigation. What does he have to conclude at the end of this in terms of this dim picture of the investigation?
Well, you have to understand, think about this, over a period of 8 months, more or less, you have 7 murders, you have burglaries, you have 1 or 2 other attacks, Ms. Borum and Ms. Miller. You have fingerprints, you have shoe prints, you have other crime scene evidence. You have every possible resource locally plus state and federal resources, and yet this guy had managed to elude everything. Gosh, what kind of a criminal is this? I mean, it's amazing. And despite all, they didn't have a real suspect. There was no one. And after the April 1978 murder, the case went cold. There were a lot of scares. There were a lot of the investigation continued. There was a lot of tips. A lot of people were investigated, but nothing substantive. And so as time went forward, 6 months, a year or 2 years, it looked like the Strangler had totally disappeared and would never be found. It was a cold case, nothing more.
Let's use this, William, as an opportunity to stop for a second to hear from our sponsor, which is Ritual. Ritual's Essential for Women 18 Plus multivitamin was formulated by exhaustive research to help fill nutrient gaps in the diets of women ages 18 plus. It is formulated with nutrients to help support brain health, bone health, blood health, and provide antioxidant support. They invested in a gold standard university-led clinical trial to prove the impact of Essential for Women 18 Plus multivitamin. Essential for Women 18 Plus was shown to increase vitamin D levels by 43% and omega-3 DHA levels by 41% in 12 weeks. Ritual has just released Synbiotic Plus, a gut health supplement with clinically studied probiotics and a postbiotic all-in-one minty capsule. Just one delayed release Synbiotic Plus capsule per day supports your gut with all the quality and traceability you'd expect from Ritual. My wife Lisa and I have been taking Ritual daily for a few years now. Lisa started first. I started when Ritual for Men 50 Plus became available. We were initially impressed with Ritual's successful clinical trials, then impressed with Ritual's overall results, and now impressed taking Synbiotic Plus. With Ritual, knowing that gut health is very important. Right now, Ritual is offering my listeners 10% off your first 3 months. Visit ritual.com/murder and turn healthy habits into a ritual. That's 10% off at ritual.com/murder. Now, William, we were talking about the case goes cold, but March 12th, 1989, we talked about a fortuitous series of events. The Bombay Bicycle Club, a restaurant in East Columbus. End of the night, a figure in a ski mask orders everybody at gunpoint out of this restaurant. Tell us how it leads to Carlton Gary.
This is one of the most bizarre tales that you can possibly imagine. It is circuitous and almost unbelievable. As noted in March 1984, the police got a silent alarm from a place called the Bombay Bicycle Club. It was like between 3 and 4 in the morning. It was a restaurant that was closing up. The manager and 2 employees were walking out the back door when a fellow in a ski mask comes up and sticks a gun in the manager's ribs and says, "Go back inside." And the first thing the ski mask robber does is lock them in the liquor cabinet, the liquor closet. There was a large locking room where they kept their liquor and beer. And so he locks the 3 of them in there. And of course, the 3 people were scared to death. And the first thing they did was barricade the door with cases of liquor and beer. And after a few minutes, the fella comes back to the door, apparently not having found whatever he was looking for, and demands they open the door. And he beats on the door and tries to get in, but he had locked him in. They locked him out. So after a while, he gives up and heads out the back door. Well, just as he goes out and gets in his car, the police show up. The fella named Spanky, that was his nickname, Spanky Bowen, a 26-year-old patrolman who was by himself. He pulls into the parking lot of the Bombay Bicycle Club and notices a blue 1977 Dodge Charger with its lights off, screeching out of the parking lot at a high rate of speed. So he, of course, flips on his blue lights and gives chase. They go up Auburn Avenue, which is a good street there, for about 3/4 of a mile, and then it sort of dead ends into I believe the name is Edgewood Road, which was a residential street. The Charger took a sharp left, but at a high rate of speed, lost it. He crashes into several cars and ends up in someone's yard with his vehicle wrecked. Bowen stops his patrol car, and with a flashlight in one hand and his radio in his other, goes up and looks in the driver's side window there and is shot twice in the forehead, and he died shortly thereafter. He did not draw his weapon. Well, he had, of course, called other police to back him up, and very shortly thereafter, the other patrolmen arrived. But by that time, the driver of this Dodge Charger had left. The commotion had attracted someone, and a witness there that lived in one of the houses had seen a white male leave the car and head in one direction. And as it turned out, there was a large creek named Lindsay Creek. It's sort of an urban waterway, oversized, not big enough to be a river, but bigger than a small little branch. He apparently had followed that up the creek. Well, obviously, with a dead patrolman and this type of crime, the police were everywhere, and the investigating officers soon discovered that the car that had wrecked belonged to the girlfriend of a guy named Lonnie Botts, B-O-T-T-S. She said that her boyfriend had the car that night, so he became the prime suspect. The police go to his mother's house where he nominally lived. She denied knowing much about it, but in the hamper they found some soaking wet clothes and thought, well, he was at least here and he's somewhere. And also as part of that search, they discovered a box for a Ruger .22 caliber automatic pistol.
Right.
Now, 2 things. In looking at the car, there were 2 spent cartridges found in the car, presumably indicating that Mr. Patrolman Bowen was killed with an automatic pistol. And these were consistent with the ones found at the home of Lonnie Botts. And it was thought that they should be looking for a Ruger pistol. Well, it occurred to someone that during the Strangler's reign of terror, some 6 years earlier, or actually longer than that, there had been a burglary at Callie East's house where an automatic Ruger pistol had been stolen. So, sort of shorten what is a long story, the search began for this Ruger pistol. And Mike Sellers, who was one of the patrolmen investigating, one of the officers investigating put out a bulletin to every police force in the nation. Very promptly, he gets something back from Lansing, Michigan, the state capital of Michigan. At the time, Michigan was one of 3 states that required the registration of pistols. They said that someone in Kalamazoo, Michigan, had registered a gun with the same serial number. They approached this gentleman who said that he had gotten this from his mother, and she lived in Gary, Indiana. So they go to Gary, Indiana, and she said that she had gotten the pistol from her brother because there'd been a break-in and she felt like she needed some protection.
Right.
And lo and behold, the brother lived in Phoenix City, Alabama. And for people that don't know the anatomy of Georgia and Alabama, Phoenix City is directly across the river from Columbus. So in other words, this led back home to this pistol that had been stolen in October 1977, right? So they approached the man from whom she assumed the lady got the pistol. His name was Jim Gary.
Yep.
They asked him where did he get it. He said he got it from his nephew, a fellow named Carlton Gary. They said, well, where's Carlton? And he says, he's in one of them South Carolina prisons. And so but he's been out on parole. So the police started investigating. And as it turned out, he had not been released from prison. One of the things that seemed to stop the Wrangler's reign of terror back in 1978 was the fact that Carlton Gary had been robbing restaurants in South Carolina and had become known as a steakhouse bandit and had been sentenced to prison. So much of the intervening time, Carlton Gary had been in prison in South Carolina. After a few years in prison, he had convinced people there that he'd reformed and he had, quote unquote, seen the light, end quote. So he was moved from a maximum security prison and made a trustee at another low security system. He stayed there for 2 weeks and walked, and he'd come back to Columbus, and he was not out on parole. He was free, and he was in the city of Columbus at that time. So as it would turn out, Carlton Gary had actually been interviewed several times by the police.
Yes.
But you have to remember, this was in the days before extensive use of computers and so forth and so on. He carried no ID and gave police a spurious and different name every time he was picked up. In fact, he'd been arrested earlier in April for smoking marijuana, and there's a mugshot in the Columbus police files, which I include in the book, where he'd been arrested actually under a different name and released on $500 cash bond. So he was there, and that is when they finally knew the man's name and they started searching. That's a long story.
Yeah, you talk about May the 1984 and his arrest, and some major characters that come into play and question him or are there for the questioning: Boren, Rowe, Detective Sellers, Miller, and Warren. Talk about they think he's a pretty bright guy. He's got a 114 IQ, I believe. How do they proceed with him, and what are the results of questioning him? Does he ask for a lawyer? What happens?
Well, you have to back up and look at this man's entire history. First of all, let me say that the police were looking for him in Columbus, but actually at the time he was in Albany, Georgia. He was down there dealing drugs, and he was at a Holiday Inn. The Albany police arrested him on the night, I believe, May 2nd or 3rd. And police from Columbus came down, picked him up, and were taking him back to Columbus from Albany. Now, Gary said, what have I been arrested for? Well, technically, he was arrested because of stealing the pistol in 1977. That was what his arrest warrant said. But the police, they didn't try to question him. They didn't do anything untoward, particularly after the Jerome Livas case. But Gary had a long history of trying to blame things on other people. Whenever he was caught, he would say, well, I was there, but I didn't do it. So-and-so did it. And there was a huge pattern of this came to play in his trial. So he started talking to the police and they asked him, well, you need an attorney. He says, no, I don't need an attorney. I'm just going to tell you the truth. And so when he starts telling the truth, he starts spinning tales, trying to defer blame to someone else.
Sure.
See, Gary had no idea what evidence police were holding, where his fingerprints may or may not have been, or how much they had on him. So they got back to Columbus, and he insisted on taking the police out and showing them things. And he said, yeah, I was there in that house, but I was with someone who actually harmed the old ladies. His name was Malvin Allen Michael Crittenden. And Mike Sellers, who was one of the officers there, said, he might have called the guy Joe Blow or John Smith, but Malvin Michael Crittenden. He said, it's a very realistic sounding name. And indeed, Malvin Crittenden was a friend of Carlton Gary's. And he was trying to dump it on his friend. And during the course of riding around that evening, he showed them the houses of 6 of the 7 murder victims. So he obviously had a lot of knowledge. And he told police things that no one else would have known, that even the police didn't know in some cases, when describing the crime scenes. But his idea was, I was there, in case you got my fingerprints, that accounts for that. But I didn't do it. Someone else did it. And that became an issue later that would sort of muddy the water during his trial, but Crittenden actually testified later.
You write that eventually the grand jury indicts him, Gary, in the 3 Stocking Stranglers, and there's a photo of him smiling.
Right.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second for these messages. Now, as I mentioned, he's liking the attention. You write that he's liking the attention, and he is a really good suspect in the 3 Stocking Stranglings by virtue of what he has said. Now enters his defense team and what they want to do with this case, what this case represents to them. Let's fast forward to the attempt at bringing him to trial.
Gary was arrested one day and indicted the next day in May 1984, and it was thought that his trial would proceed in the near future at that point.
Right.
But as it turned out, there were multiple delays on the part of his defense attorneys. He had several defense attorneys. This is a complicated bit of tale, but make a long story short, a guy named Bud Seaman ended up being his primary defense attorney during the course of his trial, which would take place, as I said, in August 1986. There were a number of motions, a number of efforts to get evidence thrown out. The allegations of the defense team was basically that, number one, he was innocent. Number two, he was being mistreated by the police. Number three, he was profiled because he was black, and so forth and so on. I think the real situation was that the defense team knew that prosecution had a good case, and they were doing anything they could do in order to lessen the blow. There's nothing wrong with that. The defense attorneys, that's their job. But it certainly put off his trial for more than 2 years after his arrest. I should comment that he was indicted only on 3 of the 7 murders attributed to the Strangler. I asked Bill Smith, who was the prosecuting attorney, why he was indicted only on 3 of the 7 cases. And the response appropriately was they were the strongest cases we have. And how many times do you need to convict someone of a capital crime?
You were talking about the trial seemingly going to be in February 86, but a couple months before, December 29th, what do the jailers discover about Carlton Gary?
Gary tried to escape. He had cut a hole in the wall of his cell and was hoped to get out. He had a history of escape from. In fact, he had escaped from prison in New York to get back to Georgia that started the Stranglers murders, and had other similar attempts of escaping. And so there were a number of things that were done to delay or obfuscate the case. One was whether or not he should have a mental status exam. He acted out a little bit, I think is the best word, and I'm trying to be objective about this, as that he might not be mentally fit. They sent him to the state hospital, Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, and when he was there, he apparently refused to cooperate, and so the idea that he might somehow be mentally impaired was dropped. That was not. There were other issues the defense alleged, but it should be understood that his appeals, based on the vast majority of the motions made by defense attorneys, ran the entire gamut of the American judicial system, from local to the U.S. Supreme Court,
right,
on a total of 4 separate occasions.
And also what you talk about, it's not so uncommon, but this was unrelenting and real concerted effort by these attorneys. They didn't believe in the death penalty, and that's what this case would potentially be, is that they did a lot of filing motions. They did everything in their power to be able to file motions, to be able to delay this case as long as possible, and to try to have each judge, and haven't even gone into this, recused themselves from the case.
Well, I think for most people that are not attorneys, and I'm not an attorney, if you think about it, you have someone who is a prosecuting attorney whose job and goal is to produce justice, that is, to bring criminals to whatever the state finds is appropriate for them. And you have other people called defense attorneys whose job is to stop that process. We speak of legal technicalities, and we speak of things that were not done correctly by one side of the case or the other. In the book, I say the old adage of justice delayed is justice denied. I think that's a common legal adage, but it's the exact opposite of what happens if it looks like if you're a defense attorney and your client has a pretty bad case against him, then you want to put things off as long as you can. And in some ways, it was successful. In fact, many of the people who would have testified at trial, if it had taken place shortly after the murders, were dead by the time during the 32 odd years after this man's eventual trial and appeals that he had. So in other words, evidence gets older and older, people's memories fade, the importance of the case seems less to jurors and so forth and so on. It's what defense attorneys do.
Absolutely. So despite their efforts eventually, tell us how long it takes to eventually get to trial date, some of the features at trial, and you say that the defense didn't have much of a presentation, not very long in comparison to the prosecution. Tell us about some of the goings on before we talk about what happens, the verdict in that trial.
The trial eventually took place in August of 1986, and during that period of time, it lasted approximately a month, including jury selection. The trial had been moved from Columbus, Muskogee County, to a nearby county. I'm sorry, the jurors had been chosen from a nearby county because of the possible issue of bias in the news media in Columbus. So people were brought in from another county to hear the case in Columbus. The trial was, in many ways, there was overwhelming evidence, circumstantial evidence, and physical evidence against Gary. And much of the defense's case rested on asking someone to prove a negative. And by that, question is, how do you know this didn't happen? And if that had happened, then maybe there's another killer that we don't know about, or maybe this, or maybe that. But the case against Gary was quite strong based on circumstantial and physical evidence. And essentially nothing the defense said really changed many people's minds about it.
Gertrude Miller was one of the key witnesses at this trial as well. And you talk about the quick deliberation at the end of this.
Ms. Miller was one of the witnesses who identified Gary. There was another lady who had also been living in the neighborhood who identified Gary. And I think you need to say that these were pretty definitive identifications in court, but at the same time, the fact that eyewitness identifications are notoriously suspect. Although in Ms. Miller's case, she had seen him close up and personal, as it were. The case eventually reached the jury. The defense, in the closing arguments, the defense tried to say that perhaps there had been police malfeasance, that perhaps there was another killer that we didn't know about, that the police had not focused on. Jerome Livas, the unfortunate black man who was accused of the killings, was brought to trial, but his testimony was not particularly important one way or the other, in my opinion. And after a while, it took the jury about 1 hour to convict him of all 3 murders and rapes and burglaries with which he was charged. Now, I should say that in Georgia, the penalty phase of a capital murder trial is separate. That is to say, the jury makes the decision guilty versus not guilty. If it is a guilty verdict, and if the state is seeking the death penalty, then a separate trial with the same jurors is held. And then this is when both sides can produce mitigating factors and so forth and so on. I know the defense in this case referred to killing Gary rather than simply putting him to death. I think the use of words in the trial transcript is absolutely fascinating. And this is a bit of an aside. In total, there were perhaps 20,000 pages of trial transcript. And reading trial transcript is very much like reading a script for a play. You know, you read the words. But I was fortunate enough to have a video of the trial. So I would read a dramatic section of the trial transcript, and then I would turn on the video and watch it. It totally changed the experience, you know. You saw what people were saying, and you felt the emotion in their voice.
What we didn't talk about is in the trial that what was deemed admissible was similar behavior,
right,
similar crimes in other jurisdictions. And so that was allowed to be read in and proved prior acts of burglary and rape and assault, didn't it?
Well, explain that a little bit. To back off and not talking about Gary, but talking about the concept in general, let's just say, for example, that someone is arrested for on trial for murder. And if the state were to come in and say, well, you know, this is a bad person anyway, you know, he's killed people in the past and gotten away with it, and he's stolen, he's been a robber and done this and that, and he's generally a bad person. So the jury might get the impression, well, he's a bad person and we should treat him for all the evil things he's done.
Right.
Well, that's not fair to the defendant.
No.
In other words, if someone is on trial for a particular offense, they should be tried for that particular offense, not for something else that they may or may not have done at some point in the past. And that's an important legal concept. In Georgia, at least based on case law, if a crime for which one is on trial for fits a pattern of other crimes that the defendant can reasonably be thought to have committed, then the other crimes can be presented not to prove that the defendant is an evil person or does bad things, but rather to show that the crimes for which he's accused and on trial for are part of a larger pattern. Okay, and that became an important case law based on the Atlanta child murders cases of about the same of a few years earlier.
Right. Now you talk about that, and obviously there's the obvious automatic appeals or mandatory appeals, and then it can go all the way up to the Supreme Court after the state courts or those appeals have exhausted. So the same people essentially are involved in the defense or want to be involved in defense. Explain this and their fervor to continue with this case.
Well, this was a death penalty case, and what I didn't say just now was that Gary was sentenced to death. And there are automatic appeals in Georgia, and I think in most other jurisdictions in this country for that kind of sentence. But you also have a group of people who are charged, the defense attorneys are charged with, if not getting him completely off the hook, mitigating the sentence to which he's been given.
Right.
So the hope was they could get a new trial. And for example, as I said a moment ago, if some of the witnesses are dead and no longer can testify, if the fervor to punish this man has somewhat cooled down, then perhaps they can get the death sentence commuted to life without parole, or even life with parole. This went on for a long period of time. The other factors here were there were people who were very aggressive death penalty opponents. One, there were people who believed that Gary, because he was a black man, was treated wrongly simply on the basis of race, although there's no evidence at all that this occurred. And there were a lot of emotional factors that came into play. This caused his appeals to span a total of 32 years before his eventual execution in March 2018.
Right. Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for these messages. Now, he was scheduled to die. It took that many years, but in the interim, his lawyers fought tooth and nail to have that stay of proceedings, to have this overturned, but they were not successful. Tell us about the end of this saga.
In the end, Gary had, as I said, exhausted all of his appeals. In total, again, to repeat myself, this case went to the U.S. Supreme Court on 4 separate occasions, and it exhausted the state and federal appeal system. And while the defense alleged multiple things that the prosecution may have done wrong, or multiple bits of evidence that might change the sentence. None of these were validated, and he eventually was executed without much fanfare in March. There are people now who still believe that he is innocent. If I can bring in a personal note here, I was doing a book signing the other day, and I ran to someone who told me that she didn't need to read the book because she knew what the truth was.
Sure.
The implication being that whatever I wrote was not worth reading because she already knew the truth. And I said, that's fine. Fascinating study in human emotion and human belief and so forth.
When I mentioned the fervor of the defense team right to the very end, they did ask daringly for DNA evidence to see if they could get any kind of change at whatsoever. It was granted, but there was some interesting developments with that DNA testing, wasn't there?
There was quite interesting, and the DNA testing was not done to 2009. And I'm sure there are your listeners who say, well, gee, why did they not do DNA testing until 2009?
Sure.
The defense had the opportunity, and it had been offered to them, but according to prosecutors, I should say, according to prosecutors, the defense attorneys had the opportunity, and it had been offered to do DNA testing earlier on whatever evidence was available, and they had turned it down. And as one person said, getting DNA testing done was a Hail Mary pass. There was Pascal's wager of sort. They had nothing to lose and much to gain. If the DNA testing showed that he was in fact one of the Columbus Strangler, then he'd already been convicted of that. But the possibility that it might somehow free him or somehow throw a wrench into everything was worth trying. Well, understand that the specimens that they were looking at were collected in late 1970s, 77 and 78, and here 2009, which 30-something, 40 years later.
Right.
The specimens were not of great quality. They had 3 specimens, one of which didn't have any semen in it, apparently. Another specimen of Ms. Diamondstein showed, in fact, that Gary apparently had raped her. His DNA matched the semen, vaginal secretions from her crime scene, but he was not charged with Ms. Diamondstein's murder. She was one of the ones whose murder he was not charged with it. And then the third case was absolutely fascinating because in this case, it showed that in Ms. Thurman's case that there was a DNA from another man. And this is a lady who should not have, she was a widow and her family had been there, and there should not be other male DNA in her specimens. And it turned out that the State Crime Lab of Georgia had made an error. They had been using control DNA specimen, which apparently had been contributed either by one of the husbands of the people that worked there or one of the workers there, male workers. And it had their workspace had become contaminated, and this showed up positive for him with this unknown DNA. This was eventually sorted out and led to a great revision in what the State Crime Lab did, how they did their testing, but it was quite embarrassing to the State Crime Lab. It looked for a while like this, there was another unknown person, but it turned out to be. So they eventually sorted it out to the great embarrassment of the state of Georgia.
Right. You talked about the media and its role in this story, and you mentioned the lady that thought she knew everything about this case despite having not read your really definitive book about this case. Let's talk about David Rose, because I found it very interesting, the being accepted with working with a law firm that was trying to defend Carlton Gary, and then the publishing of this book and the sentiments that he espoused in this book as well.
Well, let me say that David Rose is an excellent writer. He's very good style, and I think he's a great writer in terms of technical skills. David Rose is also a death penalty opponent, and he came to interview Carlton Gary with the idea that in the American South, a person of color, a black man, cannot get a fair trial, and that perhaps that Carlton Gary was innocent and so forth and so on. And he wrote a rather best-selling book of this. It was published in 2007 in both the United Kingdom and the United States. In the U.S., it was sold under the name of the Big Eddie Club. And this was really the only supposedly definitive book on this case. There are some others that had sort of touched on it, but nothing that really, no serious work otherwise. Problem with Rose's book is not his style or anything, but the fact that he wrote the book in order to demonstrate his belief that Gary was not culpable for some or all of what he was charged with.
Right.
And when you write a book with an agenda as opposed to telling the truth, you end up giving large amounts of what I don't think are particularly verifiable. The book has many examples of what I believe are referred to as narrative fallacy and confirmation bias. For example, he would say that one of the judicial members' grandfather back in the 1860s or the latter part of the 19th century had done something racist. Therefore, the great-grandson or great-grandson must also be racist as well, this kind of thing.
Sure.
And since it's the only book written, it's all people had to go on. And I hope this tried scrupulously to be non-committal in terms of making judgments in this book. I've simply tried to report the facts. I will say one further thing about Groves, which I think is important. The first book came out in 2007, and an edition came out, a second edition came out in softcover in 2010. Now, in 2007, unrelated to anything in Columbus, cold case detectives in New York were following up on the death of a lady named Marion Fisher. She was a lady in her 40s who was married, went out with her husband to celebrate the anniversary. She and her husband got to drinking. She got mad, said, I'm going to walk home. He'd been drinking pretty heavily, went home and went to bed. The next day, they found her body. She had been raped and murdered, strangled. And the husband was the prime suspect. He apparently had been drinking enough to where he didn't remember part of the evening before.
Sure.
And so between 1977 and 2007, all those years, those 30-odd years, he was the suspect in his wife's death. But as one policeman said, there wasn't enough to really accuse him officially or convict him of it. Well, cold case detectives went back and looked at that, and lo and behold, they found Carlton Gary's DNA on the woman's, on some evidence from the crime scene. And they actually interviewed Carlton Gary about it, and he said that he had gone out with a woman and had sex with her, but, nothing like this happened. Okay?
Right.
Well, this was a blockbuster of a thing, because this is a guy who's on death row in Georgia who's been strongly implicated in a murder that occurred decades before, but during the same general time frame. And the people in New York chose not to prosecute it because Gary was already on death row.
Right.
But the thing is that Rose, in updating his book, goes into great detail about what's been happening with Gary's appeals, but fails to mention the fact that he's been strongly implicated in another murder.
Sure. Interesting. Very, very interesting. In closing, you thank a lot of people, but you especially thank Detective Sellers' daughter, I believe, Sally Sellers.
His wife. His wife.
Tell us about her contribution.
There are two people that worked on the case. One is Mike Sellers, the other is Bill Smith, and I'll mention both of them. But whenever you look at something that's happened historically, you need to find people who were there, who could feel the emotion, who actually saw it for themselves. Reading dry accounts is not adequate, and Mike Sellers was one of the ones. He was the policeman who had much to do with discovering the missing pistol that led. I'm following up on the missing pistol that led to Gary's arrest, and was also involved as an investigator during the prosecution period. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of what happened. The same thing I should say for Bill Smith, William J. Smith, the prosecutor in the case, who later became a Superior Court judge. He too has encyclopedic knowledge, and talking with them and asking them about the details and saying, explain this to me. How did this happen? It was quite valuable. Mike Sellers' wife had kept a wonderful scrapbook, which they shared with me. So there were a lot of papers and information that I used in writing this book that I have to give her credit for.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about the Columbus Stocking Strangler. William, is there a website that people might want to take a look at? And Tell us when this book is released. I had mentioned it before. Tell us a little bit how people might find out about this book.
First of all, my website is my name with www.com before and after, respectively. It's www.William Rawlings, WILLIAMRAWLINGS.com. That has lots of information on this book and my other books. Interestingly, on the website, up at the top, there's a thing called Carlton Gary Timeline. If you want to know Gary's complete criminal history, you can click on this and get some additional information that's not included in the book. The book can be bought from your local bookseller. I always urge people to support your local bookstore.
Yes.
On the possibility that you don't live where there's a local bookstore, you can order it from any number of outlets, including Barnes & Noble, Amazon. There is a digital version available, and soon, in a couple of months, there should be an audio version available.
Right.
The official release date of the book is September 6th. However, it is available now in both digital and print versions. It's out in hardcover, and at some point, I think in the distant future, it may come out in softcover as well.
Thank you so much, William Rawlings, the Columbus Stocking Strangler. You have a great evening. Thank you so much for this interview. Good night.